For AKG's Stories Behind the Sessions with singer-songwriter Jackson Browne. Among the many, many songs Jackson...
Well, man, I can play like a Beatles. To me, a Beatles beat was like playing for us. Bum, 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 bum.
When we talk about Jackson Browne, most people immediately picture the calm, poetic figure who penned songs that defined an era. Tracks like Doctor My Eyes, Running on Empty, or These Days that spoke to a generation about love, loss, and the relentless passage of time. But who is Jackson Browne really when we strip away the awards, the accolades, and the polished image of a folk rock icon? Reporters who have followed his career for decades often describe him as one of the most introspective and literate songwriters of the 1970s, a man whose lyrics were closer to journal entries than pop hits, tackling subjects as heavy as political activism, nuclear disarmament, and environmental justice long before such themes were fashionable in mainstream music. Born in Heidelberg, Germany in 1948 to American parents and raised in Southern California, Browne grew up in a household where art and ideas flowed freely, and from a young age he was immersed in both the folk revival of the 1960s and the burgeoning rock scene that surrounded him. By the time he was in his late teens, he was already writing songs that caught the attention of industry insiders, with artists like Nico and the Eagles covering his work before he even had a record out himself. Yet despite this early recognition, Jackson never embraced the rock star persona. Instead, he cultivated a reputation as a reluctant celebrity, someone more comfortable with a guitar and a notebook than the chaos of fame. He was deeply embedded in the Laurel Canyon scene, rubbing shoulders with Joni Mitchell, James Taylor, and David Crosby. Yet even among those luminaries, he stood apart for his almost scholarly approach to songwriting, spending hours perfecting a single line to ensure it captured the nuance he wanted. Friends and critics alike often remarked that Jackson Browne wasn't just writing songs. He was documenting the spirit of his generation, combining personal vulnerability with social commentary in a way that few others could. But while his artistry has been celebrated, his personal life has been just as complicated. Marriages that fell apart, public scrutiny over relationships, and a lifelong reputation for being guarded about his private world. This complexity is what makes him so fascinating, an artist who seems serene on stage, yet carries within him the scars and passions of decades in an unforgiving industry. So when someone like Jackson Browne, known for his calm demeanor and thoughtful nature, suddenly opens up at 76 to reveal the names of musicians he openly disliked, it feels like peeling back a layer of the myth and finally glimpsing the man behind the music. For years, audiences thought they knew Jackson Browne, the soft-spoken legend of folk rock. But the truth is more human, more flawed, and far more interesting than the serene figure we've seen strumming his guitar under the spotlight. At the age of 76, when most legendary musicians are either reminiscing about their glory days or enjoying a quiet retirement away from the chaos of the spotlight, Jackson Browne shocked the music world by doing something that few expected. He finally opened up about grudges, disappointments, and outright dislikes that he had harbored towards 6 fellow musicians throughout his career. And reporters who covered this revelation were quick to pick the font with it. Tag him. Had spent decades carefully cultivating an image of restraint and poetic diplomacy. For so long, Browne was seen as the quintessential thinking man's rock star, a songwriter who avoided cheap drama and rarely engaged in the kind of public feuds that other musicians of his generation seemed to thrive on. So the decision to speak so candidly raised eyebrows and questions in equal measure. Why now and why so openly? Some analysts suggested that reaching such an advanced stage in life gave him a sense of freedom, a feeling that he no longer had anything to lose or prove. Others speculated that the weight of holding back for so many years simply became too heavy, and finally letting it out was less about vengeance and more about closure. In interviews, Browne himself hinted at the idea that time has a way of clarifying who truly supported him and who stood in his way, and at 76, he felt ready to call it like it is. Reporters described the mood of his admission not as bitter or vengeful, but surprisingly calm, almost reflective, as if he were flipping through a photo album of his life and stopping briefly on the faces that brought him more frustration than joy. What's fascinating is that this confession didn't come in the form of a scathing tell-all or a heated rant. Instead, it was measured, deliberate, and layered with the same introspection that has defined his songwriting for decades, which made it all the more powerful. Fans who had grown up idolizing his serene persona were stunned to learn that beneath the surface he had been carrying these private judgments, proof that even the most composed legends are not immune to human emotions like resentment, disappointment, or disdain. And in a way, it made Jackson Browne more relatable. Suddenly, he wasn't just a flawless folk poet, but a man who, like anyone else, had colleagues he couldn't stand and scars from conflicts that never fully healed. The timing also mattered. In an era where so many music legends are passing away, Browne's choice to reveal these truths now seemed to underscore a desire to leave nothing unsaid, to ensure that when his story is told in full, it includes not just the songs and the accolades, but also the conflicts and the honesty that shaped him behind the curtain of fame. When Jackson Browne finally revealed the first name on his list of musicians he truly disliked, it landed like a thunderclap across the music world, because this wasn't some obscure artist or minor rivalry. It was someone widely admired, a peer many assumed he respected, which made the admission all the more jarring. Reporters covering the revelation scrambled to provide context, digging into old interviews, past tours, and industry anecdotes to figure out what had led to such lingering animosity, and what they uncovered painted a picture of friction that had been brewing quietly for years. Browne explained that his distaste for this first figure wasn't about talent, because in truth, he admitted the musician was incredibly skilled, but about character, a clash of egos and values that left scars. He recalled moments in the 1970s and 1980s when the two had crossed paths, sometimes sharing stages, sometimes working on projects in the same orbit. And while fans might have assumed camaraderie between two giants of the era, behind the scenes there were tensions over creative control, dismissive remarks, and what Browne described as an arrogance that grated on him. Journalists piecing together the timeline noted that Browne was never one for theatrics. He rarely lashed out in public, preferring to let his music speak for itself. So for him to finally call out this musician by name decades later suggested that the wounds had never really healed. Fans reacted with a mix of shock and curiosity, some defending the musician in question, others saying they weren't surprised because stories of arrogance had followed him for years. But what most agreed on was that Browne's willingness to acknowledge the conflict added a raw human edge to his otherwise polished persona. The first name revealed set the tone for the rest of the list. It wasn't going to be about petty jealousy or casual dislike, but about deep-seated grievances rooted in the real experiences of life on the road, in recording studios, and in the cutthroat world of the music business. For those who had long admired Browne as a man above the drama, it was an eye-opening reminder that even legends are shaped by their clashes, and sometimes those clashes are powerful enough to linger for a lifetime. The fact that he waited until now to reveal it made the confession resonate even more, as if he had finally decided that the truth mattered more than maintaining old illusions of harmony. And with that first shocking name, Jackson Browne made it clear that the story he was about to tell would be unflinchingly honest, regardless of how uncomfortable it might make the music world. The world of music has always been filled with collaboration and creativity, but beneath the glittering surface of fame, rivalries often simmer. And in the case of Jackson Browne, some of those rivalries stretch back decades, quietly influencing the way he viewed his peers long after the applause faded. Reporters digging into his revelations about musicians, he disliked found that much of the tension stemmed from the hyper-competitive environment of the 1970s music scene, particularly in Los Angeles, where Browne and his contemporaries were vying for both artistic credibility and commercial success. Back then, the Laurel Canyon community was mythologized as a haven of peace and creativity, where artists like Joni Mitchell, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, and Browne himself gathered to make timeless music. But the reality, as journalists have long pointed out, was far more complicated. There was jealousy over who got radio play, bitterness about who secured the best record deals, and quiet resentment when one artist's tour outperformed another's. Browne admitted that some of his strongest rivalries weren't about music itself, but about the culture around it. Egos clashed, loyalties were tested, and what might have begun as professional disagreements hardened into personal dislike over time. He recalled being dismissed by certain musicians who underestimated his talent early in his career, only to watch them later try to align with him once his star began to rise, something he never forgot. Other rivalries were fueled by more subtle slights, songs that critics claimed were ripped off, backstage insults that spread like wildfire, or tensions over songwriting credits and royalties, all of which left lasting bitterness. Journalists emphasized that Browne was never one to escalate publicly, but privately, these incidents shaped his perception of certain peers, and by the time he revealed them at 76, it was clear that those wounds had never fully healed. Fans who grew up romanticizing the Laurel Canyon era as a golden age of harmony were stunned to hear Browne's version, which pulled back the curtain on the darker truth. That was also an era of rivalry, competition, and resentment, and even someone as seemingly composed as Jackson Browne was not immune to its corrosive effects. His willingness to finally admit that some rivalries never died gave his confession a sense of authenticity, because it showed that even decades of distance weren't enough to erase the sting of betrayal or the bitterness of being dismissed by fellow artists. For many, this revelation reframed their understanding of that legendary era, reminding them that beneath the image of camaraderie, the world of rock and folk was also a battleground where old grudges could last a lifetime. While rivalries over chart success, tours, and songwriting credits were common in the music world, Jackson Browne admitted that some of the strongest dislikes he carried throughout his career had little to do with music at all and everything to do with personalities, values, and the kind of behavior that tested his patience and sense of integrity. Reporters examining his revelations noted that Browne has always been known as an introspective, politically engaged artist, someone who treated music as a vehicle for truth and social commentary. So when he encountered fellow musicians who acted with arrogance, hypocrisy, or outright cruelty, those clashes left deeper scars than any competition over radio airplay ever could. He recalled instances where he had to share stages with artists who treated crew members with disdain, belittled opening acts, or lived in ways that completely contradicted the messages they sang about in their songs. And Browne, who had spent his life carefully aligning his art with his beliefs, found that kind of duplicity impossible to respect. One story he alluded to involved a musician who had publicly preached about peace and unity, but behaved backstage with hostility and entitlement, creating a toxic environment that made collaboration unbearable. Other personal clashes arose from lifestyle differences. The excesses of drugs and partying in the 1970s and 80s often put Browne at odds with musicians who reveled in chaos, while he preferred a more thoughtful, disciplined approach to both music and life. Reporters highlighted how Browne's grounded nature often set him apart in a scene where self-destruction was normalized, making him critical of those who seemed to burn bridges as fast as they built them. These weren't petty grievances, but deep moral disagreements, the kind of differences that led Browne to quietly distance himself from certain artists, even as fans assumed they were allies. By the time he confessed these dislikes at 76, it was clear that the anger had long cooled, replaced instead with a kind of sober honesty, acknowledging that for all the music they made, some individuals simply failed to live up to the values he held dear. Fans hearing these stories reacted with a mix of shock and validation, realizing that the legends they idolized weren't always as noble offstage as their music suggested. And Browne's willingness to expose that truth, even indirectly, gave his confession a layer of moral clarity. For him, music was never just about sound. It was about meaning, and when the person delivering the message betrayed it with their actions, the clash became too great to ignore. In sharing this, Jackson Browne reminded the world that even among legends, humanity, with all its flaws, contradictions, and personal battles, can't be hidden forever behind the facade of fame. Among all Jackson Browne's revelations, one of the most poignant was his admission of disappointment in a musician he had once deeply admired, a big star whose work had inspired him in his early years, but whose personal actions and later choices left him disillusioned. And for reporters covering this confession, it stood out as the most human part of Browne's story, because it wasn't about rivalry or arrogance, but about the heart. Brain, but about the heart, but about the heart. Brains, but about the heart. But about the heart. Browne's story, because it wasn't about rivalry or arrogance, but about the heart, Browne said, B. Browne recalled how, as a young songwriter, he had looked up to this particular figure, studying their lyrics, watching their performances, and in many ways modeling his own pursuit of authenticity on the path they seemed to embody. For a while, their paths even crossed positively. There were encounters filled with respect, conversations that hinted at mutual admiration, and the promise of collaboration that never fully materialized. But over time, cracks appeared, and Browne began to see a different side of the star, a side that betrayed the ideals they once appeared to share. Reporters piecing together the story noted that a disillusionment came not from a single incident but from a pattern of behavior, broken promises, dismissive attitudes, and choices that prioritized commercial gain over artistic integrity, all of which eroded Browne's respect. At one point, he admitted that hearing this star speak publicly about values they consistently ignored in private was like a punch to the gut, a reminder that the myth of authenticity in the music industry often crumbles when confronted with reality. Fans who heard about this disappointment could relate instantly, because who hasn't felt let down by someone they once idolized? And that relatability is precisely what made Browne's admission so powerful. Here was a man who had been idolized himself, confessing that he too had suffered the sting of realizing his heroes were flawed. The revelation carried a quiet sadness rather than anger. Browne didn't lash out, but rather spoke with the reflective tone of someone who had long since accepted the truth, even if it still stung to admit it aloud. Reporters emphasized that this moment added depth to Browne's confession, showing that not all dislike comes from conflict or ego. Sometimes it comes from disappointment, from the painful recognition that the people who shape us can also fail us. In sharing this, Jackson Browne reminded fans that legends are human, fallible, and often far more complicated than the glossy narratives we construct around them, and his willingness to admit that even he carried disappointment from a big star he once revered made his story resonate on a level far beyond the usual gossip of the music industry. For all the beauty that comes from collaboration in music, the road and the studio are also breeding grounds for conflict, and Jackson Browne did not shy away from admitting that some of his strongest dislikes toward fellow musicians were born not from abstract disagreements, but from the very real lived experiences of touring and recording, where personalities often clashed under pressure. Reporters who have spent years chronicling the behind-the-scenes stories of the music industry know that tours, though glamorous on the surface, can be grueling marathons of exhaustion, tight schedules, and constant proximity to people with whom you may or may not get along. And Browne recounted how some of his most negative encounters came during these periods. He spoke of bandmates or co-headliners who were charming in interviews but turned difficult once the spotlight was off, demanding special treatment, showing up late, or creating unnecessary tension that poisoned the atmosphere for everyone. There were instances in the studio where disagreements over creative direction escalated into outright hostility, with some musicians dismissing Browne's ideas or trying to exert dominance in ways that left lasting resentment. Journalists piecing these anecdotes together noted how painful it must have been for an artist like Browne, whose entire ethos was about honesty and collaboration, to find himself stuck in toxic environments where egos reigned supreme. He described one particular incident, without naming names directly, where a tour that should have been a joyful exchange of music instead became a nightmare of miscommunication and disrespect, leaving him vowing never to work with that person again. Fans who heard these stories found them both shocking and oddly validating, because while audiences are used to seeing the polished product on stage or hearing the final cut on an album, they rarely think about the messy human struggles that happen behind closed doors. Browne's candor in acknowledging that some of his dislikes were rooted in these day-to-day conflicts stripped away the illusion that the music world is one big family. Instead, it showed that, like any workplace, it can be filled with difficult personalities and moments that test patience to breaking point. Reporters emphasized that his reflections were not vindictive but weary, the voice of someone who had spent decades enduring both the highs and lows of collaboration, and who finally felt free to admit that some of those lows had left scars he could never fully ignore. In revealing the drama of tours and studios, Jackson Browne gave fans a rare glimpse of the hidden cost of making music. Costs measured not just in money or effort, but in strained relationships and dislikes that lingered long after the final encore. When news broke that Jackson Browne, at the age of 76, had finally revealed 6 musicians he openly admitted to disliking, the public reaction was immediate and explosive, with fans, critics, and fellow musicians all weighing in on what felt like one of the most unexpected confessions from a legend known more for his quiet grace than for controversy. Reporters who covered the story noted that social media lit up within hours, with some fans expressing shock and disappointment, unable to reconcile the serene, poetic songwriter they idolized with the blunt honesty of his words, while others applauded him for finally speaking his truth, arguing that after decades in the industry, he had earned the right to say exactly how he felt. Music journalists pointed out that part of the fascination came from the contrast between Browne's image and his revelation. This was not a rock star famous for trash talk or wild feuds, but rather a man celebrated for his sensitivity, which made his dislikes carry even more weight. Many longtime fans admitted that his honesty actually made them respect him more because it showed he was human, prone to the same frustrations and disappointments as anyone else, while others insisted that legends should rise above pettiness and keep such opinions private. The media quickly split into camps. Some outlets treated the confession as juicy gossip, publishing listicles and speculative articles about the names he mentioned, while more serious critics framed it as an important cultural moment, a reminder that the myth of harmony in the music world has always been just that, a myth. Interestingly, younger fans on platforms like Twitter and TikTok seem to embrace the drama with humor, turning Browne's quotes into memes and debating who else might secretly hold grudges, while older fans engaged in more solemn debates about what this meant for his legacy. Fellow musicians were also caught off guard. Some expressed sympathy, noting that after such a long career, Browne had probably earned the right to vent, while others quietly suggested it might tarnish his reputation. Reporters analyzing the broader response concluded that the confession was polarizing precisely because it cut through decades of silence and pretense. By naming names, Browne forced the world to confront the uncomfortable truth that even legends carry bitterness. Far from diminishing his legacy, the revelation seemed to spark deeper interest in his story, with streams of his music rising in the weeks after the news broke, proof that controversy and honesty, even late in life, can reignite public fascination. In the end, the public reaction reflected not just curiosity about who Browne disliked, but also a collective grappling with the idea that heroes are human, and sometimes the truth, no matter how messy, is exactly what keeps their stories alive. If Jackson Browne's candid revelation of 6 musicians he disliked shocked the public, the reactions from those on the receiving end of his criticism were even more fascinating, as reporters quickly turned their attention to the named figures to see how they would respond, and what followed was a mixture of denial, defensiveness, humor, and in some cases, silence that spoke volumes. Some of the musicians who were called out appeared genuinely surprised, insisting they had never realized Browne held such strong feelings toward them, while others, perhaps less shocked, brushed it off as part of the inevitable drama of the music world. One artist issued a statement suggesting that Browne must have misinterpreted certain past interactions, framing the tension as a misunderstanding rather than animosity, while another responded with biting sarcasm, thanking Browne for finally admitting what everyone already knew, turning the confession into a joke that only fueled more headlines. Journalists noted that not all the responses were defensive. At least one of the named musicians admitted to having clashed with Browne in the past and even expressed regret for how things had unfolded, offering a rare glimpse of humility in an industry where egos rarely back down. Others chose to remain completely silent, neither confirming nor denying the conflicts, leaving fans to speculate endlessly about what had really happened behind the scenes. Reporters covering the fallout emphasized that Browne's decision to speak openly at 76 created an unusual dynamic because, unlike the fiery feuds of younger artists designed to stir publicity, this was a veteran looking back on decades of history, which gave his words a gravitas that made them harder to dismiss. Some of the musicians attempted to reframe the conversation by highlighting their respect for Browne's artistry, even if the feeling wasn't mutual, an approach that played well in the press but didn't erase the sting of being named in such a public way. Fans dissected every response, comparing tones and parsing language, with debates raging online about who seemed sincere, who seemed defensive, and who came out looking worse for having been included in the list at all. Ultimately, the reactions of these musicians added another layer of intrigue to the story. While some sought to downplay or neutralize the revelation, others inadvertently reignited old debates, proving that Browne's words still carried power to unsettle, even decades later. In the eyes of reporters, the varied responses underscored the complexity of the music world, where relationships are often fragile, reputations matter as much as melodies, and the truth once spoken can echo louder than any song. By the time Jackson Browne reached the end of his candid confession, naming the 6 musicians he had disliked throughout his long career, it became clear to reporters and fans alike that this was not merely a list of grievances, but something much more profound, a message about honesty, legacy, and the freedom that comes with age. At 76, Browne had nothing left to prove. His songs had already secured his place in history, his activism had demonstrated his values, and his influence had touched generations of artists. So why speak out now after decades of silence? Analysts suggested that the act of naming names was less about bitterness and more about closure, an attempt to tell the unvarnished truth before time ran out, because as much as people celebrate legends, the myths built around them often obscure the human being inside. Browne's willingness to admit that he disliked certain peers reminded the world that authenticity has always been his guiding principle, both in music and in life, and that pretending harmony where none existed would be a betrayal of the same honesty he had championed in his lyrics for decades. His deeper message then was not simply, "I dislike these 6 people," but rather, it's okay to acknowledge conflict, disappointment, and hurt, because those things are as much a part of life as success and joy. Reporters observed that the calm, reflective tone with which he made his confession stripped it of malice, transforming it instead into a meditation on the cost of a lifetime in music. The egos endured, the betrayals remembered, the heroes who fell short, and the colleagues who never lived up to the ideals they preached. For fans, this was a revelation not just about Browne's personal dislikes, but about the reality of the music industry itself, a world where behind every hit song lies a complicated network of relationships, not all of them pleasant. In many ways, Browne's honesty at 76 served as a final act of artistic integrity, proving that even in confession, he remained committed to telling the truth, however messy it might be. Journalists covering his words concluded that his legacy would not be diminished by the revelation but enriched, because by admitting his flaws and frustrations, Browne stepped out of the myth of the untouchable legend and into the realm of the relatable human being. And perhaps that was his ultimate message, that greatness does not come from pretending life is perfect, but from facing it honestly, even when it means admitting who you could never forgive or forget.